Why, hello. Welcome back to another Book Thoughts. This time, we actually have a recent book, which is crazy for me. It is The Witcher, Crossroads of Ravens by Andrzej Sapkowski, as all The Witcher books are. This is a new book that came out October 1st, 2025, and I just finished it yesterday or the day before, at the time of recording, obviously. Now, let's talk about what this book is. It is not a continuation of The Witcher because Sapkowski wrote the saga. That's from that's the five books that end. Ooh, God, I can't remember now. I believe it starts with the blood of the elves and ends with the Lady of the Lake. That to him is the end of Geralt's story. That's it. He likes to write more Geralt, but anything he writes more of Geralt from this point or from that point onward is prior to the end of the story. This is, as far as I know, the earliest that we will see Geralt, the youngest that we will see Geralt. This is Geralt as a young man, and as a matter of fact, if we look at that, he's so young, he's a baby face. Anyway, this is Geralt as a young man, and it's actually his first time going out, walking the path, being a itinerant monster hunter. All right, so that's the high level of what it is. We have drama, we have thing, but let's focus in here. What do we want to say about this book? Number one, it's good. Number two, it's not as good as the saga, but the saga is fantastic and just another level. So that's just right off the bat. So whenever you're reading this book, or whenever I was reading this book at least, it was very interesting to see how my emotions went. So it's not much of a spoiler just to say at the very beginning, we have Geralt literally right as he has left Kaer Morhen at the end of his training, and he gets himself into trouble, and there's an older Witcher there by the name of Preston Holt, and he kind of takes Geralt under his wing. Now, if you are a Witcher fan, you would say, who the hell is Preston Holt? Which is fair, because we've never met this Preston Holt character before. So, who is Preston Holt? Preston Holt is is one of the old guard, a contemporary of Vesemir, right? Maybe not that old, but old. He is incredibly skilled, and at the beginning, you almost get a sense of him being Geralt-like. Geralt, in the beginning of this book, is very quiet. Now, Geralt's not a chatty guy necessarily all the time, but he philosophizes and he has wit and, very dry, sardonic wit, and he makes jokes and he grumbles at Dandelion and all of these types of things. This is a very young Geralt. He's less than 20 years old. He is still very much within his shell. Preston Holt has a lot of that kind of terse gregariousness. I don't really know how to say it, but he presents at first with a lot of the same charisma that we are very familiar with an older Geralt having. As I said, he takes Geralt under his wing, and he trains him beyond what the Witcher School had trained him. He gets him ready for dealing with the world. He teaches him how to negotiate. Don't sell yourself short. All of these kinds of things, and ties him into a thing. This story takes place entirely within the kingdom of Cadwyn. Cadwyn is not somewhere that we see much in the Witcher saga. So that kind of gives us some new ground to cover, some new polities, some new politics going on. It's all very good. And Cadwyn is then further broken up into the crown lands in the center that are directly beholden to the king, and 4 marches on in each direction. There's a march, and those are ruled by a margrave, and the margrave is wildly independent. And so each of these margraves is kind of like a miniature king, and each of these marches is kind of like a miniature kingdom. So we move around through those, and we get a lot of world building through that. We also end up getting a lot of lore about Witchers prior to any of the stuff we knew before, right? Preston Holt is an older Witcher. He has more knowledge. So we get some more Witcher lore about the beginnings of Witchers and stuff like that. Very unreliable in kind of a fun way. Preston Holt, it's not like he's trying to pull the wool over Geralt's eyes, but he just says a lot of things. And it's hard to tell exactly what's true, what's a joke, what's a lie. It's very unreliable in an entertaining way. The other thing is that we find out a lot more about that pivotal attack on Kaer Morhen that makes Geralt one of the last of the Witchers. And that is a theme that comes throughout the book, is the attack on Kaer Morhen, because that is still very fresh at this time. And it's very connected to the kingdom of Cadwyn, because Cadwyn is the kingdom that is closest to Kaer Morhen, so that's where the mobs came from. We see Geralt grow up over the course of this book. As I said at the beginning, he's very terse. He's very, but not terse and in the cool macho, like I'm in control of the situation kind of way. Terse in and quiet in the way of I'm a fish out of water and I'm in over my head, and I'm just gonna let the adults talk. Obviously, that's not the Geralt we know from much later on. So we do a lot in this book to bridge from A to B. We see Geralt become more confident. We see him become much more start to be forced to become somewhat philosophical about things, and we see that wit, and we also see Geralt start to get torn between, the monster hunting and the personal, what his job is versus, being involved with, again, stopping humans who are bad. All of these kinds of things we actually see develop over the course of the book. We also get some fun progress in him as a competent monster hunter, and in that way. I think most interestingly, towards the middle of the book, we have a fight versus a Striga. Now, if you've read or if you're familiar with The Witcher, Geralt's fight against Striga is the first story in the first collection of short stories that was ever published about Geralt. It's the opening cutscene to the first Witcher game. It is I think, in the first season of the Witcher TV show. The Striga fight is just a pivotal, like, essential Geralt moment. And here we have him dealing with another Striga. Similar kind of, things put before him. There's politics going on. There's factions. There's a young girl who has been turned into a Striga, and there is in this case, a Margrave instead of a king, but who wants the Striga turned back into a girl rather than thing. Now, I think this was one of the best moments in the book for encapsulating Geralt not being the Witcher Hunter, the monster hunter that we are familiar with from later. I'm not going to tell you how it goes down, but the writing there is very much set up to parallel what happened in the original story, but then set up a study of contrast. In terms of the actual prose of the book, I would say that the characters are still pretty vibrant. I didn't connect with as many of them as I normally do in a Witcher book. Preston Holt stood out. Geralt, as soon as he started becoming the character we knew, was still great to read. The priestess. I'm gonna butcher this name. Nenike. How would I pronounce this name? I'm sure some of you. Nenneke. Nenik. We're gonna go with Nenik, who is another character familiar from the saga. They were all great. Some of the secondary characters were mildly interesting, but most of them didn't really stick around either. This is really a story of Geralt and Preston. I wouldn't necessarily put any other character in this book on the same level as those two. And they had a very interesting relationship, and they're both very interesting characters. In terms of the prose, the writing, it definitely it was good. It was good writing. It didn't have necessarily as successful of a playfulness as some of the previous books, where Sapkowski, a lot of times he likes to play, he likes to try things. I in these novels, and I typically am very much enjoying them. I don't know if it's that maybe some of this doesn't translate as well to English, some of the wordplay or some of the grammatical play or mirroring of sentences. It's very possible that it's fantastic in Polish and it doesn't translate as well to English. In which case, fair play. The man should write in the language that he's, that he's a master of, and I take what I can get from a translation, and that's just what it is. But for my reading experience, it didn't have some of that same command. Furthermore, as I read through the saga, I always enjoyed his experiments with narrative structure. There's without getting too far into it, it felt like towards the end, those last couple books, that each book was a whole experiment in narrative structure that just really it delighted me. I loved the weird narrative structures that he was using. I thought that they did some interesting things for ways to pull me into the world or pull me, my sense of things in one way or another, or just sometimes just be entertaining in and of themselves. In this case, we don't get as much of that. It's a lot more just, chronological, just very, structured, thing. The two things that I would say, though, that make it perhaps a little bit of a play. Well, there was one chapter, actually, that tickled me, because in one chapter we just switched entirely to an epistolatory style or structure. It was just letters being sent between people regarding things that were happening in the plot. And that was fun, a really fun change of pace, and I actually really enjoyed how that played out. The other thing that is interesting structure-wise is it is a singular narrative that runs through. However, at the same time, it's almost it calls something back to those short story collections. In the short story collections, the short stories were anchored by a framing narrative that somehow pulled, I'm especially thinking of The Last Wish here, where each short story and the framing narrative, they pulled together in a direction to build the framing narrative into a story of its own that had a satisfying conclusion. In this case, each each place that he goes and each challenge he faces there, these marches are very self-contained, and so they kind of form their own short stories almost. Like, I think you could probably approach them as short stories. You would be a little lost sometimes in terms of some characters who show up throughout. And then if you read those as short stories, you could read them all independently. And then the end sequence then requires you to have read all the short stories to know how it all ties together at the end. I think that's fair to say. I think that's interesting. I think that it's not as interesting as some of the other narrative experiments that he's done before. One side note that I think is interesting to discuss here is this is something that's gone through in the gaming sphere, especially, is Sapkowski in an interview saying that the games and therefore everything that's pulling from the games mistakenly read a comment about the wolf school in one of the stories to mean that there were many Witcher schools when there weren't. Within, if you've read the sagas, about Cohen, who came from, who was one of the cats, right? And so you'd think, well, but that is a different Witcher school, right? So then we have two. But then in this story, we have Preston Holt. His medallion, he's from Kaer Morhen, but his medallion is a viper. So I think this is interesting. In one sense, yes, there are, at least in this book, as far as I can tell, 3 lines of Witchers from 3 places, which functionally is 3 schools. Kind of like they're doing slightly different things, and we got the cats and we got the is it the School of the Wolf? But then Preston Holt's got the Viper. Or is it like the School of the Wolf in that Geralt's the Wolf and that was his school? I don't know. I don't know. I I don't know. I don't know what Sapkowski has in his mind. It's very interesting. I think then functionally, like, this is a lot smaller of a step removed than perhaps the headlines imply. I don't know if this is because Sapkowski has something in his brain that this really that the idea of Witcher schools really conflicts with, or if this is because people really like reporting on Sapkowski as a grouch, a lovable grouch. Don't get me wrong, but people really bought into that. So anything he says where like no, they don't have it right is being elevated to the position of higher conflict, which I suppose is totally possible. All right, so what are we going to say at the end about this book? I think that this book is a good time. I think that it is a good read. I think that it is one of the better books that I've read this year, and I've read some good stuff. I think it doesn't reach the level of the original short story collections or the saga, but I still think that I enjoyed it more than the first book in the Hussite trilogy, also by Glenn Cook, or not Glenn Cook, sorry, wrong author, Andrzej Sapkowski. I really liked the first book in the Hussite trilogy. I think I liked this more. Did I like it more just because I love this world? It's possible. I don't know that it's actually better than the other book, or if it's just my emotional attachments making me feel stronger about it. That's a really good question. A couple other things of interest here are the politics of the world, there are some things here that I would argue perhaps represent a shift within Sapkowski's mindset, and so I think that would be a really interesting study to look at some of the things, some of the through lines, specifically the topic of abortion minorly comes up here again, and it minorly, and it more in a more direct way comes up in the saga. And there's, in the here there's a just like a couple like side comments because it's part of like some world building things, and in the saga it's part of Geralt having philosophical conversations with people, because he does that all the time in there. There's some interesting potentials for contrast in that, but at the same time I almost wonder if he wasn't doing some character viewpoint work, because there's also some interesting things about, we have the princess. I keep saying that priestess, Nenike, is a very very positive character, right? That is someone who's portrayed very very positively, and is a priestess with a goddess and all of that. At the same time, in another part of the book, there's commentary on like religion being pointless and stuff like that. Makes me think that maybe we're doing a lot more subtle point of view world building and infusion of that into the narration. And it's really interesting because it's done in a way that you would almost assume that it's author commentary, but it's conflicting with itself, especially in that case, which I just think is very interesting and would be very interesting to think about more and study more, but is obviously outside the scope of this video. I keep getting sidetracked because I have a lot of thoughts about this book, and yeah, it's part of my fall/winter of books meant for me. Next up is the first Glenn Cook book in a long time. Before that comes out, obviously we have some more things that are going to come up on the channel. I'm going to pick a little horror game, something short, and do something like that for Halloween. And I don't know what else yet. You never can tell. I have lots of ideas and only so much time. But that's it for now. I will see you guys next time. Bye-bye.